She stumbled forward, gasping as the harsh air burned her lungs. Each breath felt like inhaling shards of glass, her chest heaving under the weight of the toxic atmosphere. The sky, a sickly yellow, cast long shadows across the barren landscape, and jagged rocks jutted out from the cracked ground, threatening to trip her with every step. Somewhere in the distance, a low growl echoed, making her flinch. Her legs trembled, weak from days without proper nourishment, and her hands shook as she instinctively clutched at her chest, trying to calm her pounding heart. But the fear never left. The planet was alive with hostile energy, a world that seemed to pulsate with violence and hunger. The air tasted foul, tinged with something metallic that made her tongue feel numb. The vegetation, if it could even be called, that was twisted, with sharp-edged leaves and thick, sinewy vines that coiled in unnatural shapes. The creatures that roamed here were even worse, grotesque and predatory, always lurking just out of sight. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting for a moment of weakness. She knew she wouldn't survive much longer. Her body, frail compared to the predators of this world, wasn't built for such strain. Her species had always been delicate, reliant on intellect and negotiation rather than brute force. They avoided conflict, choosing diplomacy and cooperation as their strength. But on this planet, none of that mattered. This place demanded strength, aggression qualities she did not possess. Her feet dragged as she forced herself to keep moving, knowing that if she stopped, the creatures would pounce. Her energy waned as the planet's harsh environment drained the last remnants of her strength. She had been fighting off smaller creatures for days, barely managing to escape their claws and fangs, but each encounter left her weaker. Her once pristine clothes were torn, dirt-streaked, and soaked in her own blood. She no longer remembered when she had last slept. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind knew that rest meant death. The ground beneath her shifted, a low rumble signaling the approach of something larger. Her legs buckled, and she collapsed to her knees, her hands sinking into the rough, hot dirt. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had been betrayed by her own people, cast aside like she was nothing. They had left her here, knowing full well she wouldn't survive. Her thoughts wandered back to the moment they had abandoned her, the coldness in their eyes, the way they had turned their backs without hesitation. She had been a liability, an inconvenience in the middle of political maneuvering she couldn't understand. They were pacifists, yes, but when it came to self-preservation, their moral high ground crumbled fast. They had left her with nothing but the thin hope that maybe, somehow, she would find a way out. But she had known from the moment her feet touched the ground of this cursed planet that no one was coming to save her. Her fingers curled into fists, digging into the dirt as she fought back a sob. She was weak. Her kind had always been soft, relying on their words and intellect to avoid conflict. They had never prepared for the raw violence of survival. Here, her peaceful nature meant nothing. The monsters here didn't care for her intellect. Her reasoning, they only saw prey. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world into an eerie twilight. The growls grew louder, closer. She knew they could smell her fear, her exhaustion. She was too weak to run anymore, too tired to fight. Her gaze darted to the horizon. The silhouette of a massive predator appeared, its hulking form illuminated by the faint glow of the planet's twin moons. Her heart seized in her chest. The creature's eyes glowed with a predatory hunger, its jaws wide, rows of teeth glinting in the dim light. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Her body refused to move, her legs trembling as if they belonged to someone else. She was too far gone, her strength drained by the endless struggle for survival. Her breathing became shallow as the creature closed in, each of its steps shaking the ground beneath her. She braced herself for the inevitable, closing her eyes against the darkness. The predator's breath washed over her, hot and rancid. She could feel its presence towering above her, its claws scraping the ground as it prepared to strike. This was it. She was done. Her breath was shallow, her mind slipping into darkness as the predator loomed over her. The weight of the world pressed down and she felt herself sinking, surrendering. But then, in an instant, everything changed. A blur of motion broke the tension. She barely registered what was happening before the predator was yanked back, its growl cut short by a loud, sickening snap. Her eyes fluttered open just in time to see it collapse to the ground, limp and lifeless. She couldn't comprehend it at first. One moment, death had been inevitable, and now, it was gone. Her gaze shifted, and there he was, a figure standing over the fallen beast. He didn't make a sound, didn't utter a word. The human moved with a fluid precision, pulling out what appeared to be a blade from the creature's neck, wiping it clean in one swift motion. The blade disappeared back into his pack, and before she could react, he was already working setting traps, scanning the area as if every motion was calculated. Her pulse quickened. The stories her people told about humans were filled with fear. Brutal, instinct-driven creatures that thrived on conflict, incapable of peace. She had been taught to pity them, their need for violence, their lack of restraint. But watching him now, she didn't see brutality. She saw skill, cold efficiency, and a raw power that made her stomach twist. She wanted to stand, to move, but her body wouldn't obey. The human didn't seem to care. His focus was on his task, inspecting the creature he'd just killed, as though confirming it posed no further threat. Her eyes widened as she watched him pull a rope from his pack, stringing it across the clearing where they stood. Simple yet effective traps were set in place with an expertise she'd never seen before. He worked in silence, never looking her way, but she knew everything he did was for protection, for survival. Her heart pounded in her chest, unsure whether to be more afraid of the human or the monsters on this planet. She had always been told they were dangerous. But if he hadn't appeared when he did, the realization hit her harder than she expected. She would have died. Still, she couldn't shake her fear. He was human, after all, and there was no telling what he might do next. She watched him warily, her body aching as she tried to sit up. When he finally turned toward her, his face was shrouded in shadow, unreadable. No words, just silence. His eyes scanned her injuries quickly, clinically, as if assessing how much longer she could last. He knelt, pulling out a small pack from his gear. Without hesitation, he pulled out bandages, tending to her wounds with a mechanical precision that made her wince. His touch wasn't gentle, but it wasn't cruel either, just firm, as though time was more important than comfort. His silence only made it more unnerving. She was too weak to resist, too shocked to speak. She let him work, her mind racing with conflicting emotions. Her species had always believed in the power of reason, of peace, of words. But here was someone who needed no words, whose strength lay in action. Her body was still trembling from exhaustion, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from him. He had saved her without hesitation, without asking for anything in return, and yet, she couldn't trust him. Not yet. The human finished bandaging her wounds, then rummaged through his pack, pulling out some kind of protein bar. He broke it in half and handed it to her. Her stomach growled in response, but she hesitated, staring at the food as if it were some kind of trap. But the human just stared back at her, his expression unreadable. There was no malice in his eyes, only a silent offering. Finally, hunger won over fear. She took the food from his hand and ate, her body desperate for sustenance. The human watched her for a moment, then returned to his preparations, gathering materials to create a makeshift shelter for the night. She marveled at how quickly he moved, how every action had a purpose. There was no wasted energy, no unnecessary movements. He built the shelter in near silence, only the occasional grunt escaping his lips as he adjusted the structure. As she watched, a strange thought took root in her mind. They had always viewed humans as barbaric, unrefined, but what she saw now wasn't barbarism. It was survival, something her people had never truly understood. Her people had relied on technology, on diplomacy. But here, on this planet, none of that mattered. Survival wasn't about intellect. It was about adaptability, strength, and an unrelenting will to endure. The shelter was small but sturdy, and when he finally motioned for her to enter, she hesitated again. Trust didn't come easily, especially not now. But she had no choice. Her body was failing, and he seemed to be her only chance. She crawled inside, curling up against the cold ground, still keeping her distance from him. He sat just outside, his eyes scanning the horizon. He hadn't spoken a word since he arrived, and she wondered if he even would. It was strange to think about a creature so capable of destruction, yet so silent. Perhaps he didn't need to speak. His actions were louder than any words could be. She wanted to ask him why he had saved her. What was he doing on this planet? But something told her the answers didn't matter. The only thing that mattered here was survival. The silence between them stretched on, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel something other than fear. Relief. She was alive. But before she could sink too deeply into that fleeting emotion, a low, rumbling growl pierced the air. Her heart seized in her chest. Another one. The ground trembled slightly, and she saw the human stiffen. He stood quickly, grabbing his blade and moving toward the edge of the clearing. His traps were set, but she could see in his posture that even he wasn't fully prepared for what was coming. Her stomach tightened as she watched him move into position. The shadow of the new creature stretched across the ground, larger than the last. Her pulse quickened again. She wasn't safe yet, and neither was he. She watched as the human moved with practiced efficiency, setting up another series of traps along the perimeter of their makeshift camp. Every motion had purpose, no energy wasted. His hands, strong and sure, demonstrated a quiet mastery over the materials around him. She had no choice but to learn from him. This was a world that demanded survival instincts she didn't have, and as much as it unsettled her, she realized that she needed his guidance if she wanted to live. He beckoned her over, holding out a crude but effective weapon, something sharp, crafted quickly from materials he had scavenged. At first, she hesitated. Her people didn't fight. They believed in reasoning, in solving conflicts with words, not violence. But here, reason had no place. She took the weapon from him, her hands trembling slightly, and he showed her how to use its simple motions at first, teaching her to swing and defend. It felt unnatural in her grip, but the human's firm gaze left no room for hesitation. He corrected her stance, showed her how to hold her ground. Slowly, she began to understand that this wasn't about attacking, it was about survival. The weapon wasn't for violence, it was for defending her life. The human's lessons were direct, without speech, but every demonstration showed her that he knew exactly what he was doing. His movements were precise, and in them she could see the instinct of a predator. It unsettled her, but at the same time it gave her a strange sense of security. Then came the creatures. They moved fast, quicker than she could have imagined, their grotesque forms slithering and lunging toward them. Panic seized her, her body freezing for a split second. But the human was already in motion. He struck first, his trap snapping shut on one of the creatures, while his weapon pierced the throat of another. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. He moved like someone who had done this 1,000 times. She forced herself to move, to remember his teachings. Her arms felt weak, but as another creature lunged at her, she swung the weapon with all her strength. The blade connected, and the creature let out a guttural screech, stumbling back. Her heart raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but she had survived the first blow. The human glanced at her, nodding slightly. It wasn't approval, it was acknowledgement. There wasn't time for more. Another creature came, larger than the others. It moved swiftly, eyes locked on her, and her instincts screamed at her to run. But something in the human's earlier lessons kept her grounded. She remembered the traps, the tactics. He had told her to stay calm, to think ahead. So instead of fleeing, she stepped back toward the edge of the camp where one of the traps lay hidden. The creature lunged just as her foot brushed the trigger. The trap snapped shut around the creature's leg, halting its momentum with a loud crack. The human was already there, his weapon slicing through the air, finishing the job. The beast collapsed in a heap, and for a moment, all was silent. Her hands shook, the weapon still clutched tightly in her grip. She looked at the fallen creatures, their grotesque forms twitching in the dirt, and then back at the human. He hadn't spoken a word, but the message was clear: survival demanded brutality. It wasn't about cruelty, it was about necessity. The human had proven himself again and again, not just as a fighter, but as someone who understood the raw, unforgiving nature of this world. They fought together for hours, and with each new wave of creatures, she grew a little stronger, a little more capable. The human's guidance was silent but powerful. He showed her how to anticipate attacks, how to use the environment to her advantage. He demonstrated the importance of patience, of waiting for the right moment to strike. And slowly, she began to see the world through his eyes. Her people had always viewed humans as impulsive, driven by base instincts. But what she saw now wasn't impulse, it was strategy. Humans, she realized, were not just predators, they were intelligent, adaptable predators. They could read the landscape, understand the enemy, and use every available resource to survive. The human wasn't just strong, he was smart, capable of thinking ahead in ways her people had never considered. She found herself admiring his resilience, his ability to face overwhelming odds without faltering. The way he could turn even the smallest advantage into a victory made her see him in a different light. Her earlier fear was fading, replaced by a growing respect for the human's abilities. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, signaling the end of the relentless assault, they finally found a moment to rest. Her muscles ached, her hands raw from gripping the weapon, but there was a strange sense of accomplishment settling over her. She had survived. And more than that, she had fought alongside the human, learning from him in ways she never thought possible. They sat in silence, the human tending to his tools and weapons, while she stared out at the horizon. The bond between them was unspoken, but it was there, undeniable. She had come to rely on him, not just for protection, but for survival. Without his knowledge, his instincts, she would have perished long ago. Her thoughts drifted to her people, the pacifists who had left her to die. They had believed that words and intellect could solve everything, but here, on this planet, those ideals had no place. This world demanded something else, something humans possessed in abundance. And now she understood that humans weren't brutes as her people had claimed. They were survivors. Tough, resourceful, relentless. She glanced at the human again, watching the way he moved with quiet confidence, and something shifted within her. Trust. It had been building slowly over the hours they had fought together, and now it was undeniable. He had saved her more times than she could count, without asking for anything in return. She no longer questioned his motives. He was her only hope, and she knew, without a doubt, that he was capable of getting them both through this. As the night crept in, she allowed herself to close her eyes, knowing the human would stand watch. For the first time since she had been left on this planet, she felt a flicker of safety. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the air grew heavy with an unfamiliar pressure. Both of them stood still for a moment, sensing something far worse than the creatures they had faced so far. The alien girl's pulse quickened as a low, rumbling growl echoed across the barren land. In the distance, a shadow moved, larger and more menacing than anything she had seen before. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she knew there was nowhere to go. This was it, the final challenge, the ultimate test of their will to survive. The creature emerged from the darkness, its sheer size enough to blot out what little light remained. Its hulking form towered over the landscape, claws that could rip through metal, teeth as long as her arm. Its eyes, glowing a sickly yellow, locked onto them with a hunger that sent chills down her spine. She felt her knees weaken as the monstrous beast let out a deafening roar, shaking the ground as it advanced toward them. The human didn't flinch. She watched him closely, marveling at his composure in the face of such overwhelming danger. He surveyed the creature for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. There was no panic in him, no hesitation. He was already thinking, already planning. She could see the wheels turning in his mind as he calculated their next move. He signaled to her, and she knew instantly what he needed. Without a word, she moved to assist, gathering the supplies and setting up what she could. It wasn't much, just another trap, some basic tools, but it would have to do. They had no other choice but to fight, and this time the stakes were higher than ever. Her heart raced, but she pushed her fear aside. They had survived everything so far, and she couldn't let doubt consume her now. The human moved quickly, his actions decisive and precise. He set up a trap designed to slow the creature, something that might give them the slightest edge in the coming battle. She helped as best she could, but the sheer size of the beast made her doubt whether anything could stop it. Still, she followed his lead, trusting his judgment as he guided her through the preparations. When the creature lunged, the human was ready. He activated the trap, and for a brief moment the massive beast was held back by the tangled ropes and sharp spikes. It roared in fury, thrashing wildly as it struggled to break free. The ground shook beneath them, but the human didn't waver. He moved with deadly efficiency, attacking the creature with everything he had. She watched in awe as he fought, each strike calculated, each movement driven by a relentless determination. His tactics were brutal, but there was a grace to his combat, a controlled fury that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. The creature fought back, its claws slashing through the air, narrowly missing him as he danced around its attacks. He was relentless, never giving the beast a moment to recover. But even with all his skill, the creature was too powerful to be taken down so easily. It broke free from the trap, lunging at the human with a speed that defied its size. She saw the danger and acted on instinct, grabbing the nearest weapon and striking the creature just as it closed in on him. Her blow didn't do much damage, but it distracted the beast long enough for the human to deliver a crippling strike to its leg. The monster let out a pained roar, stumbling as it tried to regain its balance. They fought side by side, each attack carefully timed, each move a desperate attempt to survive. The alien girl's body ached, her muscles screaming in protest, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Not now. The human pushed forward, his strikes becoming more precise, more lethal. He was wearing the creature down bit by bit, but it wasn't enough. The beast was still too strong, and she could see the exhaustion setting in on the human's face. In a final, desperate move, the human set one last trap, a makeshift explosive he had crafted from the limited supplies they had. He signaled to her again, and she understood immediately. She led the creature toward the trap, using herself as bait, her heart pounding in her chest as the beast's attention shifted to her. It was terrifying, but there was no other way. She trusted the human, and she knew he would act in time. The creature lunged at her, and at the last possible second, the human triggered the trap. The explosion sent shockwaves through the ground, and the beast let out a final deafening roar as it collapsed. Dust and debris filled the air, and for a moment everything was still. The alien girl's legs gave out beneath her, and she fell to the ground, her body trembling from exhaustion. When the dust settled, she saw the human standing over the fallen creature, breathing heavily but still standing. They had done it. The monster was dead. The aftermath of the battle left them both wounded, their bodies battered and bruised. The human tended to their injuries in silence, using whatever supplies they had left to patch them up. His hands were steady, his expression calm, even as blood seeped from a deep gash on his arm. She watched him work, her admiration for him growing with each passing moment. He hadn't flinched, hadn't faltered. He had fought with everything he had, and even now, after all they had been through, he remained focused on survival. As he finished bandaging her wounds, she realized something profound. Humans weren't just survivors. They were something more. They were relentless, adaptable, capable of facing impossible odds and still finding a way to win. Her people had always underestimated them, viewing them as little more than violent creatures, driven by base instincts. But now she saw the truth. There was power in their resilience, in their ability to endure and protect. She looked toward the horizon, where the twin suns were beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the desolate landscape. The human stood beside her, his eyes scanning the distance, always alert, always ready for the next challenge. Together they had faced death and survived. And now, as they prepared for the next leg of their journey, she felt a strange sense of peace. She had never imagined that a human of all creatures would become her ally, her protector. But in this unforgiving world, he had proven himself time and time again. His strength, his courage, his unyielding will to survive it left her in awe.